So, so I was talking with Jonah at AgStack the other day. Someone I met at a D-Web conference where Mark Nadal was speaking. He's the founder over at Era, working on decentralized database stuff, and Jonah really impressed me with what he's working on with over at AgStack, and we got talking about philosophy and other plans, how what he's doing really meshes well with what I'm trying to do with education and marketing/media. And I had another one of those moments that recently, doing my research into different types of founders, I'm realizing I relate a lot to Steve Jobs, not really in the visionary sense as much as the temper sense. Who knows? Maybe those are connected, but at this point, I don't see it. I just see that. My temper kind of bursts. My ego really comes through when I lack an appropriate response to people's reactions. I'm definitely one of those people that I plan everything out in my head by planning out everything that could happen. The unfortunate reality of that is our imagination isn't infinite enough in its computing power to come up with reality. Sometimes I get lucky. The more I do it, the more often than not I get lucky, which is, I guess making my own luck. But there are those occasions that a reality happens that I was not expecting, and I lose my cool, and I don't like that. I see in hindsight how Steve Jobs got blamed for that, but the more I learn, the more I understand about people like me, especially people on the Asperger's spectrum, getting my ego in check so that I can find that calm, that peace, that center of harmony. I find it tedious to keep running into this ego hit where just because I don't know something or know how to explain something the way I truly mean it, I lose that cool. I am getting better at expressing my vulnerability, but I often project in those situations, but I've learned how to pivot that projection to checking to see if the other person is feeling the same way as me, and if they don't, I use that as an opportunity to let go. If they are, I use that as an opportunity to be empathetic. But let me get right into it. So the thing I really got upset about was when I was explaining the dynamics of us versus them and how to fight that us versus them mentality. It comes across as us versus them to communicate how to combat us versus them, because combating us versus them is not combative, it's inclusive. It's not exclusive, it's harmonious. there's something that Jonah said when I was explaining it, where I was using terminology, the us versus them terminology that we all are really trained to do because that's the way the world is. And he said something very profound to me. He said it's not us versus them, it's all of us versus all of us. And I'm like, that's so profound, because that's what I see, where it's socialism at the bottom, capitalism in the middle, and socialism again back at the top. Even the most successful capitalists go to socialism. I mean, that's what it means to be a publicly traded company. And at that point, you realize as long as there's preferred stockholders and common stockholders, that's capitalism at the bottom, but socialism at the top, if you have preferred ownership. And this is quite profound to me, because I've realized that the versus mentality in itself is an us versus them mentality, even if it's all of us versus all of us. So I was trying to think of a way to rebrand that in my mind. And what came to me was not us versus them, but us and them. Because in an us versus them, or a all of us versus all of us mentality, us and them sounds like us versus them, because we're not on the inside, but we're not exactly on the outside the same way other people are on the outside in an all of us versus all of us scenario. Whereas all of us versus all of us is trying to get onto the inside of the us versus them mentality. But in reality, it's never anything more than all of us versus all of us. It's an illusion of order when anarchy and chaos are already in full swing. That is what is truly at play when you have two opposing ideologies like capitalism and socialism warring for each other, warring for control. But really, capitalism, the great thing about it in my mind is the productivity. The great thing about socialism in my mind is the cooperation. But when cooperation is used to keep people busy and they're not on the in, I mean, that's the same thing as industrial socialism, which resorts to slave camps and all that stuff. So at the same point, the whole idea of oligarchies that socialists tend to point out about capitalism that industrialists play at is really quite interesting to me, because whether or not you have industrial capitalism or industrial socialism, industrialism is that inclusive, the exclusive, man in the middle, but also on top. Because as long as you have control, if you have operating control, you have ownership. What good is ownership if you don't have control? And at that point, you realize we're all co-owners in nations where we have an illusion of control. But at the end of the day, if you can't work your entire life and have ownership of every, ounce of your labor, that's not really ownership. I mean, that's just slavery with more steps, I guess. So I'm trying to figure out how to rebrand this in a way. I think the us and them mentality, which feels like us versus them to everyone trying to play the us versus them game, but they're really all in the all of us versus all of us game. So to drop the verses and have it just be a us and them, it's completely inclusive, completely lateral and inclusive. Anyone can create their own natural hierarchy, but they also can't abuse a natural hierarchy system through very manipulatable power nodes such as democracy. A democratic position of authority is wildly dangerous. Democracy works when it's for the people, by the people. But when there's a position of power that has control over others that you can gain control of through popularity, that's wildly, wildly dangerous. I mean, that's what leads to the fall of Rome that Socrates was worried about. That's what, would lead to the fall of America that Ben Franklin was worried about. a huge fan of Socrates, the father of the Republic, literally wrote the book on the Republic that Plato later penned based on his teachings. But it was his ideas. Like, Socrates was the father of the ideas of the Republic. He was the father of the Republic of that time. He was also killed for speaking out about democracy. Ben Franklin was very aware of the dangers of democracy. That's why when they finished the Constitutional Convention and they said, "What type of government did you pick, Mr. Franklin?" he says, "It's a republic if you'll keep it." Because at the time, they didn't really have the communication methods to do anything better but have like blind anonymous voting. That representatives could carry those votes with them. But now we live in an instant communication world, and we can solve the biggest problem in Ben Franklin's idea of a republic, which is democracy. Not to say that democracy is all bad. Look, democracy on the internet is great. I mean, that's how we found out that we like cat videos so much. It's also how we found out like what it means to self-educate with the internet. It's why things like Wikipedia exist. It's why things like e-courses exist. I mean, that's democracy at its finest. Being able to self-educate and help others spread knowledge, like gain those audiences. People who can gain a creative audience, cutting out the middleman like record labels and studios and stuff like that. That's quite powerful. With crowdsourcing resources, whether that's attention, money, politics, with, resourcing a movement and impact that people want to do. But that's where it also gets dangerous. Being able to manipulate a democracy. Republics aren't set up for the digital age when they're analog in nature. So a digital democracy that exists online can manipulate any analog democracy system that was set up 200 years ago. That's just, something Putin dropped an inconvenient truth bomb on America by saying, we created the weapon for our own destruction, and we were reckless enough to not see the correlation between an analog democracy and a digital democracy, and we're blaming essentially the wrong people for manipulating it and hacking it. We shouldn't be blaming China and Russia when we should be blaming our own marketer, like people like me, marketers, the PR guys, the ad men. Like, we are the ones who understand how that system works to manipulate it. And yet we're almost glorified. Everyone wants a marketer. We got to a point within the past 15 years, everyone wants a marketer for what they do. They understand the value of marketing, but I think the general public has yet to grasp the dangers of marketing. The code of ethics for marketing is a joke. We use the same exact tools as psychologists, but our code of ethics is almost non-existent compared to it. The only time it really has teeth is when a marketer uses the word cure. Other from that, there's almost no self-regulation from marketers for, any sort of code of ethics. It's really just, how can you profit as much as possible? And if you do something illegal, just say you didn't know, whether it's honest or not. And if you're actually trying to manipulate, don't get caught. That's really the three things to be an ethical marketer. And most marketers, they follow 2 out of those 3 max. And that's really, really sad. We're using all the same psychological tools as psychology and psychiatry, yet, the regulation is literally just don't break laws. No, there's no self-regulation of marketers. We're practicing an advanced skill set. Most people don't know psychology, so they still need a consultant to help them out with that, whether it's a psychologist or a life coach, somebody who understands how the psyche works. Marketers are the same thing. We practice an advanced skill set. Anyone who practices like an objective art type skill set, like psychology or engineering, like that's an advanced skill set, or more of a subjective art skill set, like, like code, or like artificial intelligence, or marketing, or sales. All these things are very, very subjective. One is more leaning towards the analytical, one is leaning a little bit more towards the creative. But try explaining sales to an engineer and marketing to an engineer, as opposed to like trying to explain the need for process to a marketer or a salesman who just figured out that hack to get something to work. But the engineer is worried about sustainability and, scalability and all these things. It's quite frustrating, because communicating across these divides means we have to bring harmony to logic and paradox. Where right now we see logical paradoxes as a bad thing, but that wouldn't be so if we had, something like paradoxical logic, which is pretty comprehensive if you look at logical fallacies. The problem is they're so story-based that it requires remembering the principles of logical fallacies and comparing them against reality to see if it matches up. So it's not something you can really memorize or write off a checklist to see if something is a logical fallacy. It's subjective. Like you have to, number one, know the details, and number two, be open to believing it. So at that point, we have this lack of communication. I see that as first and foremost a branding problem in today's terminology. Like, properly branding something, you properly brand a concept. And we have a lot of new concepts over the past 15 to 35 years that are not branded. They're almost what I call anti-brands, where it's not this, it's anti that. Like, that's anti things, they don't exist in the human mind. Not anti things like that. Like, our brain doesn't track those things. Our brains don't track the negatives, they track the positives. So when there's a disparity between a number of negative things and a number of positive things, we tend to get diluted. When we look at the big picture, we see more positives than there actually are. But then when we go down into the micro and see all the problems, we lose track of all the positives. So the difficult thing is, how do we translate all these negative concept labels that are like, anti-capitalism, anti-gun, and really communicate things differently so they make more sense? Because, at a certain point, even pro-gun people are for gun control to some point. I mean, that's how they see, if everyone had guns, that is its own form of gun control. And there's, a paradoxical logic and a beauty to that sort of, ideology. Is it practical? That's completely subjective. That's for anyone to guess. I mean, if everyone owned a gun, I guess, yes, it would be practical. But in the transition, how do we make sure that certain people don't milk that and abuse it? I mean, that's a great question. And I think that's why the people who are pro-gun usually, support background checks. They don't support more background checks, but they obviously don't support no background checks. And even the ones who do, they have their own idea. Like, they believe that everyone who could protect everyone will get their hands on guns quick enough to self-regulate. Maybe they're right. I mean, it's at a certain point, we have to understand that without a sort of paradoxical logic framework, we tend to miscommunicate our ideas, or as marketers would call them, our brands. And because we don't have them properly defined to our own subjective meaning, and that's tough, because when anything exists, like anti-capitalist, anti-socialist, whatever it is, like it's really just anything that sounds like this concept that some people think is good is bad. When that's taking it to the extreme, you can't find harmony, you can't find a middle ground. And at the end of it, like a good compromise leaves no sides happy. So if one side is trying to be happy by having an anti-concept, they're never going to gain any traction. So figuring out how to neutralize anti-concepts to something, where we can agree on a middle ground, we can find a new positive concept, bridging something like Mark Nadal does brilliantly, bridging capitalism and socialism into freeism, taking the best of both worlds, upgrading with technology and other things to really find that middle ground. Because even the most pure capitalist is usually pro-family. What is a family unit if not a socialist unit? It's a socialist unit where you're all working together for a like-minded goal, like that vision, that central vision of the family that everyone agrees on. Yes, you may have black sheeps that, don't feel like they belong, but after they get to a certain point, they're welcome to leave. And if they really, really need to leave, they can. And if they don't, then that's an unethical family unit that is gonna get broken up when the truth comes out. Like, that's what always happens. So at a certain point, you start to realize that we are hurting our end goal because we don't know how to explain how to get there without a paradoxical logic framework. I've gone over a lot in this video that, starting in one place, going to another place, and kind of coming full circle here. It may seem like I went on a roundabout tangent, but that's kind of what harmony is. It's a roundabout. You have to come full circle. Just like a wheel on a car is useless if it has a hole in it. It has to come full circle. And at that point, it seems almost like circular logic, but paradoxical logic is understanding the logic of how things connect together, identifying the holes, and patching them up. But in reality, it's almost like we all have tires that have holes in different spots, and that holes that look differently. Some people, the holes in their tire, they're because there's a nail in there. Other ones, it's a big blown out hole. The difference is everyone's trying to argue which tire is better, but this one's blown out and this one has nails in it. So at the end of the day, we have to say, all right, we need to start over. We need to build a new tire. And that's, I think, what paradoxical logic is in its core. It's a logical framework to understand the paradoxes, not hate them and run away from them, but understand why they're there and find out a logical counterpiece to that paradox to replace it. Because the paradox exists because we don't have an explanation for how. Not that it's impossible to get from point A to point Z because of that paradox. It's just saying we're going to have to probably invent a way to get there. And you don't do that by surrounding yourself with like-minded people. If we want to figure out how to upgrade capitalism or upgrade socialism, we can't do it with only socialists in a room working on how to upgrade socialism. We can't do it with only capitalists in a room thinking of how to upgrade capitalism. Because while we have an us versus them mindset, and it's all of us against all of us, we have to do us and them. Bridge those gaps. And that's really what harmony is all about. Like, we're trying to bridge divides rather than try and tear them down, because I see divides as like walls of scars. You can't tear down a wall of scars. That only reinforces the wall of scars. You have to bridge over that wall of scars, use it to remember why we built that wall of scars, give it time to heal, let that swelling go down until it heals. And we have the bridge there, and it's a memorial bridge. We want to know why it was there. All the stories that came out of telling why it was there help us remember the purpose of that bridge. Even when the wall of scars is gone, we still remember that, which is really important, so we don't go and start building more walls of scars, because that's what's dividing us. Period. Like, inconvenient truth, end of the story. Like, we can justify, rationalize, like, make excuses, apologize for why it isn't so, but that's the inconvenient truth of the world. We can either bridge divides, or we can keep trying to tear down walls of scars that only seem to get more reinforced the more we do it. We can either lead with hate or empathy. And empathy isn't about being nice. It's about being kind, which is listening through the stuff that doesn't sound nice until you can find something you can work with. Understanding that they believe what they're saying, and that doesn't mean that just because you know how to believe what you believe doesn't mean they do. And they're never going to get there if you're telling them how they're wrong. That's it. We can't do it by knowing more than other people. We need to do it by listening more than we used to. That's the path. That's how we rebrand our hate so that we recognize it as hate. That's how we rebrand love so we stop forgetting about it. So we stop reacting to hate and forgetting about love. That's it. That's how we unite. This is how Martin Luther King Jr. did it. This is how Nellie Bly did it for the mentally ill in the 1880s and their anxiety epidemic of the 1800s. This is how we move forward into the future. We have to recognize our mistakes. We have to own them. We have to put proper labels on things, despite us millennials not really liking labels. Like, we have to get over that. We have to figure out a way to create a label for the labels we don't like and create a label for the labels we do like, and understand how to label things appropriately. That's what it is. We've upgraded to a point where we need more labels than we have. And that's the problem. But we have to do the hard work of defining these labels in a way that is easy to understand. That doesn't mean creating a label for multiple concepts. It means creating a label for each individual concept. It's a lot of hard work. But if we don't do it, we're going to keep fighting. And we're never going to figure out how to build a better future.